Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. This episode is about some of the content that is in the Oxygen episode on criminal confessions tonight, December 7th, dealing with the Chris Watts case. I'll be providing an extended version of this episode if there's interest, if people are curious about what is said here. Maybe some people will disagree, maybe they won't, but if you are interested in extended version to this, then I'll do something on Patreon. Speaking of which, thank you very much to the over 100 patrons that are already there. If you're interested in the content, which just tends to be a deeper dive than what we do here on YouTube, head on over there. I'm also currently busy this weekend in wrapping up my book on the Frazee case, Murder Most Foul. So that's part of the reason why this episode is likely to be shorter than usual. For those enjoying this channel and those enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't already, please share amongst your networks, and let's get started. Now, this episode is really based around an NBC article. Chris Watts' case investigators are still reeling. How does this happen? And what the headline is suggesting, reinforcing, emphasizing, repeating is just this notion that the Watts case took a psychological toll on these sort of hardened lawyers, hardened agents, and so on. And we're going to see how that psychological toll is relevant to the analysis that they have made of the Watts case. Now, in the Oxygen documentary, the first time we've ever seen Agent Tammy Lee from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation is in this episode. And the bottom line in the for me in this discussion that she has on television is where she's asked, she's asked to sort of evaluate Chris Watts' version, and she says that she does believe that his final version was the truth. She says, I have to say yes because it was more horrible. The agent then goes on to refer to some of the aspects of the case that troubled her. She seems to have a indelible memory of possibly autopsy photos that she saw of Bella being retrieved from the oil tank. And she says, I can't get that image out of my head. Again, this is also based just on that NBC article. She was asked, do you believe that version was the truth? And this was the version that Watts gave directly to the agents and lead detective on February the 18th. And her response was that we all struggled with the fact that we did not know what the truth was. Sorry, I've made a bit of I've just put the cart before the horse here. She was asked whether she believed the original version was the truth, so the first confession. And so she struggled with the fact that after the first confession, him saying that Shanann had killed the children, they knew that wasn't the truth, and so they were wondering what was the truth. For me, the irony is this fact that they seem to be accepting the truth now, saying that that second version is true and that they're now no longer struggling with the truth. I found that a bit ironic. When the same sort of question was put to Steve Wren, the Deputy District Attorney, who was also closely involved in the case and talking to the Ruseks, he sort of just mentioned that they had never, meaning the prosecutors, but then he broadens it to say nobody had ever contemplated that the girls were alive when what drove them to the oil side. So it's almost like he's saying the fact that Watts has sort of trumped their wildest imagining, the fact that he's said something that no one had considered, it's almost like, well, that must mean it's true. And then another familiar face, the district attorney, Michael Roark, he's also commenting on the veracity of Watts's second confession, and he says the same thing that basically the other two are saying. The fact that the interview he gave was worse than any of us could have possibly imagined, well, that must mean it's true. And that's really the bottom line, as I say, of the episode. If the second version is more horrible, it must be true. And it must be emphasized here that this is all about the second confession. It's not about what came after that. In fact, it doesn't seem as if there's any acknowledgement that there was a version after the second version. And we know that there was. Now, I was quite interested just in being aware of this notion where you say, well, if the second version is more horrible than the first, it must be true. I'm just wondering, is there some kind of logic argument where there's kind of a disorder or a fallacy or a well-known cognitive response that falls in line with that? So I googled it. So I googled literally, second version is more horrible, it must be true. And I didn't know what I would come up with, but what came up very at the top of the search was a list of fallacies from Wikipedia, and this particular one was known as the appeal to worse problems, known as the fallacy of relative privation. And it has to do with dismissing an argument due to the existence of something that is worse. Now, I want to give myself a bit of a disclaimer here. I haven't really had a chance to research this aspect nearly as much as I would like to. I have gone into some depth on the blog post that I've written that's related to this, but I certainly haven't researched this in the sense of that I would like to, which is to write a couple of chapters about it and to really explore this notion of the fallacies, and by doing that to sort of navigate those that are more and less relevant. So in that respect, I feel a bit that I don't really have the kind of ammunition that I would want in order to do that. So that's just the disclaimer I want to give. Having said that, I have done some research, and I'm going to just deal with that briefly before we go into the merits of the article and what I think is the reason that there may have been an error. Now, on the original blog post, I provided a link to a complete list of rhetorological fallacies, and these fall in various categories. It's all to do with errors and manipulation of rhetoric and logical thinking. So it's all to do with how like all the various ways that we process information inaccurately. And this is from a great website called Information is Beautiful, and some of the categories that these many fallacies fall into are, for example, appeals to the mind, appeals to the emotions, faulty deduction, manipulating content, garbled cause and effect, something known as on the attack, and another category known as reset. For reasons of completeness, I would really like to deal with a handful of these, and then just show why some are more relevant than the others, and why it wouldn't necessarily be just one, but it could be quite a few. But just because of time restraints, I want to just deal with one. So I'm going to be dealing with one here, and it's the appeal to probability. Simply put, the appeal to probability is assuming because something could happen, it will happen. And so in the Watts case, you've got a true crime scenario where we know some of the details, we know where the children ended up. We know where they were at the beginning of the previous evening, and we sort of have a hole in the middle, and what's has filled that hole for us is basically joined the dots of our thinking, and we are choosing either to go along with those dots, or to go along with some of them, or to go along with all of them. And this is why it's so important to understand what's his psychology, and also the system of thinking that he uses, in order to see not only how he thinks and why he thinks the way that he does, but also why we've got to be careful following it every step of the way. And this brings us back to that article that's on NBC. How did this happen? The toll that was taken on the investigators. Now, what the episode is claiming is that the investigators are still reeling. So it's December 2019. It's almost 18 months after the crime. What they're saying is that this long, almost a year and a half later, the investigators are still reeling, and that word itself almost suggests being muddled, being thrown for a loop, being caught off guard, being unsure, right, in the cognitive sense. And so what the article goes into is just a couple of quotes from the documentary, and one of them is Agent Lee saying, admitting that they all struggled with the fact that they didn't know what the truth was. Now just bear that in mind on its own terms, is that she sat with what's in the interrogation cubicle in the Frederick police station, and she was there for several hours. She administered the polygraph test, and despite all of that time, despite all of those hours, they still didn't know what the truth was, and they were struggling with this. And so they then took this thing, and they went and they went to Dodge Correctional to get the truth. That was the reason they went there. Now I've written a blog post on what the other potential reason could have been, which had to do with the civil suit and death damages. And for that, one needs to do a deposition. You see depositions in similar scenarios, which I've quoted in that particular article. And so if you go through the rest of that NBC article, you can see it's all got to do with the second confession, the last words that Bella spoke, the whole daddy no. I've already gone through that also on the blog in various posts dealing with, did she say no daddy or daddy no? How come he appeared to have gotten this wrong? There's also a another special agent from the CBI who said, I was not able to detach myself from this. And what he's admitting there is just that he's emotionally been emotionally affected by this case. And he said, I don't get emotional very often. I've investigated over 170 homicides. He said this case was difficult to remain detached from. And so this is what I'm referring to as a possible reason for the attachment to this last version, is that they have been traumatized perhaps, or compromised in some ways, and so this is why that they've stuck with this last version of what is. They haven't really been able perhaps to interrogate it the way they otherwise would if it wasn't taking this psychological toll. And so right before the end of the article, Agent Tammy Lee basically reiterates what she says people have asked her. Do you believe him? Do you believe the final version was the truth? And she's basically saying here that second confession was the final version. And she says, I have to say yes. I have to say this final version is the truth, because it was more horrible than I'd ever let my mind go to. And then she refers to it as a complete act of evil. I don't think that's really an explanation for what it is. To say it's evil isn't really saying what happened, why it happened, how it happened, what the psychological process was. But there's a serious problem with what Agent Tammy Lee's kind of conceding here in criminal confessions. Can you see what it is? can you see why it looks like there's a fallacy here, and why there's a serious error in what is being promoted in this documentary? Now, in the blog post, I've spent a little bit of time just trying to acknowledge this whole notion that human beings are error prone, because I know a lot of people will be listening to this and saying, how dare you, you're not very close to this case. Well, I have written 10 books about it, but who was closer to this case than these prosecutors? Who was closer than this agent? My counter argument is either perhaps they were too close, perhaps they are too close to the case, and also that people make mistakes. If you look at someone like Einstein made some serious mistakes. There's even a book about Einstein's mistakes, The Human Failings of a Genius. We are even mistaken, a lot of us, about Einstein, thinking that he failed mathematics when we were at school. It's a popular myth. So the fact that people make mistakes and that their fallacies in our thinking shouldn't be seen as something new or exotic or unknown. It's common. So I am suggesting that there's a fallacy in this particular episode, and again I just want to refer you to a whole host of rhetorical fallacies, and then just highlight a couple. There's the appeal to incredulity, there's the appeal to novelty, there's the appeal to popular belief, which I think is definitely going on here. There's the appeal to fear. This is a much worse version, so it's scary, it's scarier, it's got to be true. And then, as I say, the one that's quite obvious, I think, in this case, is the appeal to probability, because it seems probable. Isn't it possible? Isn't it likely? In the extended blog post, and I can go into this in more detail if people are interested, but I have spent a lot of time debunking the second confession. I did that when I covered the second confession in Annihilation and Oblivion, which is just to say Chris Watts gave a different version when he gave his second confession. He basically minimized what he did by saying that he just snapped, that he wasn't thinking, that he wasn't in his right mind, that maybe some kind of dark force took over his thinking, which has also come out in the third confession, which is that it wasn't premeditated. It was a crime of passion. He wasn't thinking, basically, and that comes through again and again in the second confession. And what is wrong with this is it doesn't correspond to the actual plea deal. It doesn't correspond to what Chris Watts agreed to when he signed the plea deal, which is that all the murders were after deliberation, which means after premeditation. And so the fact that you have these prosecutors and the agents saying, and they're very familiar with the case, they're very familiar with the merits of the case, saying that the second confession they accepted. Maybe they don't accept all of it, but it seems like they are accepting it. It just seems strange that they don't seem to do it with limitation. Now, I've got to put in another disclaimer here and just say I haven't watched the episode. I've watched snippets and trailers like everybody else, so it may be that they explain that aspect. They might say, well, we don't agree with this and this is not likely or whatever, but from the article that is taken from the episode, it doesn't look like they are disputing any aspects. It looks like they're simply saying that's his final version and I believe it. And I find it hard to think that that's accurate. And so I'd like to put the ball in your court. I'd like to ask whether you think the crime is premeditated. Because if the crime is premeditated, then the second confession doesn't hold up. In the third confession, acknowledged in the letters to Cadle, Watts admits that he did premeditate the crime for weeks. So, which is true. In other words, his first confession basically acknowledges premeditation in that Shanann kills the children, he then kills her. He sees what she does, and then he disposes of them in the tanks. Not so much, but there's a certain amount of premeditation in that. Strangling takes a while to do, and he knew exactly where he was going to dispose of all three bodies. There was no calling the emergency numbers or anything like that. I know it's not a very strong argument, but all I'm saying is from there it goes to no premeditations, totally a crime of passion. Suddenly it's all very emotional. Chris Watts, this guy who isn't emotional, is suddenly caught, overcome by emotions, and that's why he commits the crime. That's what he's trying to lead you to believe in the second confession. In the third confession, we're back to premeditation. So which version are you going to believe? We can get very serious and very studious and very academic, and we can go through all the fallacies and all the sophisticated arguments about how does one recognize truth and how does one apply logic to arguments. We can do that. But it may be that what is going on here is actually just the meat and potatoes thing of bullshitting someone. It's an appeal to ignorance. And so that's why I find it so unacceptable and so unpalatable, is this whole thing of, we know so much about the Chris Watts case. Are you really telling me that we're supposed to pretend that we don't know about the third confession? We're supposed to pretend that we don't know about what was said during the original sentencing hearing on November 19, where the district attorney said this was a cold, calculated crime. It wasn't an act of rage. It was cool. It was coolly calculated, which is why which is why Watts was found guilty of a crimes committed after deliberation in all three cases. Shanann, Bella, and Cece. Watts signed that in acknowledgement, consented to that accusation, and was sentenced the maximum because of those aggravating circumstances. So why do we suddenly have amnesia about that? And so I think to understand this, to understand how we are where we are, I think one's got to put the pieces of the psychological puzzle together. Chris Watts's psychology, which I still think is not understood. There are still books coming out that want to call him a psychopath with no emotion, I guess, and a narcissist. And it's not really addressing his actual psychology, which is, as an introvert, as a social misfit, he just feels inadequate. And this is why he consents to the way that he's being led down the garden path in the interrogations. He doesn't volunteer his confessions, he's led into them. And this is also not being acknowledged. If you found this line of inquiry interesting, if you found this thought process worth expanding on, let me know. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. But that's all for now. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do. Please join the conversation. Leave a comment. If you'd like to receive notifications, ring the bell. If you would like extended commentary on this, I can do so. More than likely I'll do that on Patreon. Once again, thank you very much to the 100+ people that have signed up there. Again, based on the interest here, I might do an extended version there. There is an original blog post that you can refer to in the meantime. But otherwise, enjoy your weekend and enjoy the episode when it airs, and I'll be back to provide some more analysis once it has come out. Thank you for listening.